Okay, so guys, we've looked at these questions here. What is DNA made out of? What is its structure? Where is it? How does it fit into the cell? What does it actually do? Well, the last one, we haven't covered that one yet, so that's what we're up to, guys. What does DNA actually do? So we've looked at its structure and all that stuff, but what does it actually do? Isn't that the most important thing? Well, we've kind of covered it a tiny bit. We've said that DNA gives us our characteristics. It's our DNA that makes us who we are. And more specifically, it's actually that sequence of those bases that make us who we are. So it's time we look at this idea of what a gene is, because it's the genes in our DNA that actually make us who we are. So, guys, if we have a look at our DNA, so I've got it here. Remember, we just looked at this idea that a chromosome, so a chromosome here, is basically a DNA sausage. So a chromosome is basically a coiled up section of DNA. So the DNA coiled up into that sausage. And remember, it's just the two copies stuck together, this bit in the middle of the centromere, holding those two copies together. Now, if we uncoil one of those copies, we'll find it's made out of a long section of DNA, and some of those sections actually code for something. Some of the sections, like maybe this section here, maybe that gives us one of our characteristics, like gives me my brown hair, alright? Maybe it's what gives me my green eyes. So this section of DNA might actually code for something. Now, this section here might not actually code for anything. So it might not actually give me any characteristics, and I could maybe even chop it out and it wouldn't really have any sort of massive effect. So most of our DNA is actually technically non-coding, doesn't actually give us any characteristics. Now I want you to think of DNA as it's the source of information for these characteristics. So I don't have green eyes because the DNA in my eyes is actually green. The DNA codes for the green color. So it's the information, it's the recipe for that green color. And what that means is that our DNA is essentially like a recipe book, and the genes are the recipe. But there are still some blank pages in our recipe book. And they're often referred to as junk DNA, because they don't code for anything. But they're actually a little bit more important than that. They play an important role in essentially organizing the genome, organizing all this DNA in the cell. They may play an important role in organizing it, even though they don't code for anything. They play an important role in some of the sequences that don't actually code for anything are markers. They mark where the start and where the end of a gene is. And thirdly, I think it's important to realize that having some blank pages in our recipe book is actually important in an evolutionary sense. There's some blank pages there where we can write potential new recipes, or where new recipes could be developed. So in an evolutionary sense, having some parts of our DNA that don't code for anything, well, those are areas where new genes could develop without messing up existing genes. So maybe it's important for our evolutionary potential. But what's interesting is, I guess that means there's still a lot of potential there, because only about 1% or maybe 2% of our DNA actually codes for something. Anyway, if we have a look here at our DNA, so this is a chromosome. It's a coiled up long length of DNA, and some parts of it will code for a characteristic. So a gene here is a sequence of bases and it's a specific sequence of bases that essentially that code for a characteristic. Now we can get a little bit more specific than that. Sorry, my writing with the mouse isn't too great. So guys, here a gene is a specific sequence of bases that code for a characteristic. Now we can be a bit more specific than that. The gene actually codes for what's called the protein. a protein is proteins are the moving working parts of our cells. So our cells are kind of little sacs that are full of water, but actually inside our little sacs of water, these little cells, are lots of thousands of different types of proteins that are running around and piecing things together, breaking them apart, moving things from one place to the other. And all of those moving working bits, the gears and cogs, or the workers inside our cells, are proteins. So a gene is a specific sequence of bases that actually codes for a protein that gives us our characteristic. So it's the product of the gene. The gene is essentially a recipe for a protein, and it's the protein that does something in our cells that gives us our characteristics. So a gene is basically a recipe for a protein that gives us a characteristics. But we've got to stick with kind of the official definition here. So a sequence of bases that codes for a characteristic. Alright, so if we look at this, a chromosome can contain many genes. So I want you to think of a gene as, like I said, a recipe for a protein / characteristic. So it's the recipe for a protein that gives us a characteristic. So the gene is a recipe. Alright, so a chromosome might be a recipe book. It's got several recipes in it. Now at some point you might need several books. So our cells, human cells, actually all contain 46 chromosomes. So there are 46 recipe books that you need to make a person. So a set of all of the genes, a set of all of the recipes that you need to make someone is called the genome. A genome, literally the definition for genome is an entire set of DNA that codes for an organism. So it's an entire set of all the recipes needed to make a living thing. So every one of our cells contains an entire copy of the genome, an entire set of all of the recipes. Now that has two kind of fundamental things. Well, why are all our cells different then? If every single one of our cells has all of the recipes in it, why are some cells skin cells and some cells muscle cells and some cells brain cells? Why do they, why can they be different if they've all got the same recipes? Well, it's kind of like saying, if I've got the same recipe book as you at home, are we going to be having the same thing for dinner? Well, no, because we might be using different recipes. So every cell has an entire set of all the recipes, but only uses certain recipes. So our skin cells and our muscle cells, our brain cells, will each be using different recipes at different times. So it's not even just in different cells, but at different times they might be using slightly different recipes. So none of our cells are probably using all of those recipes at any one time. Just like if you've got a recipe book at home, you probably, sometimes you might be making several things out of the recipe book. You might be making a dessert and a dinner and, whatever, but you generally wouldn't be making everything in the recipe book. So a gene is a recipe, a sequence of bases that codes for a protein that gives us a characteristic. And a genome is the entire set of genes that code for a person or make us who we are. It's an entire set of those recipes. And every single one of our cells has that entire set in it. So another interesting fundamental kind of thing is that technically, for me to make a copy of you, a clone, all I need is one cell, because it contains all the information, all the recipes, an entire set of the DNA, everything I need to make a copy of you. Now, kind of even scarier is that often when we go into a room, we shed a few cells and, maybe a hair falls out, whatever, but we often don't actually leave a room without leaving a bit of our DNA or leaving at least one cell somewhere. So in the future, a bit scary maybe, if all someone needs is one cell to make a clone, make a copy of you, and you tend to probably leave cells everywhere you go, well, interesting thought. That might actually be quite easy one day for someone to actually make a copy, make a clone of you. It's illegal at the moment, and there's not really any research going into cloning humans, but in theory it's definitely possible. So every cell contains an entire copy, an entire set of these recipes. Now lastly, that really there isn't any other possibility. It wouldn't be possible for our cells not to have an entire set. Because if you think about it, guys, we started at some point, we started our lives as a single cell. When an egg and a sperm fuse together, we at some point were just one cell big. And that cell grew and divided into 2 cells, and those 2 cells grew and divided into 4 cells, and they grew and divided into 8 cells, and then into 16 and 32 and 64 and 128 and so forth and so on. They kept doubling each time. And if the DNA when the first cell somehow got halved, well, eventually most of us are probably roughly a trillion cells. Well, there'd be hardly anything left in each cell. So I guess what I'm saying there is every time the cell divided, the entire set of DNA, the entire set of recipes, the genome, was copied so that every cell would get its own copy. So guys, every cell in our body contains the entire genome, the set of genes or recipes needed to make us who we are. So those terms again, chromosome is a DNA sausage, so a structure that's coiled up, tightly compacted and coiled up DNA. Alright, it contains many genes, which are coding regions or specific sequences of bases that code for a characteristic. And the entire set of those, so all 46 chromosomes, all 46 recipe books, is called our genome. Cool, guys, I hope you found that helpful, and let's get on to the next one.